Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Rachel Ashton, and I'm on the marketing team here at Ionic. And for today's presentation, I've got Matt Netkow, our Senior Product Evangelist, and Bryant Plano, our Solutions Consultant with us, and they'll be discussing top Cordova challenges and how to tackle them. So before passing it off, I wanted to let you know during this live webinar, you can submit questions using your control panel, and we'll answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to you guys.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Hey, everyone, thanks for joining us. We are going to be talking about top Cordova challenges and how to tackle them today. Really excited to be here again. I am Matt Netkow, part of our product marketing team, and special guest today, Bryant Plano from our Ionic Customer Success team is joining me for our live Q&A at the end, so stick around for that. We are here to answer all your questions. We have a packed agenda today, so I'm going to get right to it. Lots to cover. We're going to start with an overview of the hybrid application ecosystem, how that fits in with Cordova and Ionic, and then jump right into a variety of different Cordova challenges, issues that you all as developers likely have encountered, and we're going to be sharing tons of tips and tricks and going really deep on this one. Really excited for that. All about Cordova, as well as some live demos showing off how to debug on a real Android and iOS device, and really excited for that. So let's get started. A little bit of background before we get into the meat of this, especially if you're kind of new to the Ionic ecosystem itself. So first thing is, what exactly is a hybrid application? You may have heard the term before. Basically, it allows us to, as web developers typically, to take our web development skills and apply them and extend them onto different platforms. Typically, we think of mobile for this, so iOS, Android, Windows Phone, and desktop and beyond. And what we are able to do is use our existing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills to use those same kind of skill set and write one code base that can extend onto other platforms. And how this specifically works is basically, as you all know, they're web technologies, so they have to run within a web browser. And what we do there is actually use technology called Cordova, or PhoneGap, as you may have heard it called, what that provides us is allows us to run our web code inside of an embedded web view, which is basically an embedded web browser within a native app shell. So at the end of the day, to our end users and anyone using their software, it looks and feels like a native app because it basically is a native app. And really, what's really cool about the Cordova side of things and why it's so powerful is, as web developers, we don't necessarily want or have the time investment and all that kind of thing. We don't want to learn the native platforms, the tools and technologies, all that kind of stuff. And so Cordova gives us access to the different device capabilities. So your camera, Bluetooth, plugins, all those kind of things are exposed to us via JavaScript APIs. So we can interact with them in the preferred normal format, JavaScript in this case. And then, so the Cordova as a baseline gives us access to that native technology, but there's no UI components behind it. It's very low level, and it's just another tool of many that we have to use to build a hybrid application. So enter the Ionic framework, so of course from our team here. And that is our mobile-ready UI library. We have over 100 UI components that work everywhere, so across any platform, device, and framework. So that is, combining those together gives you the mobile, desktop, PWA, all kind of functionality and UI for those hybrid apps. So again, you can build for mobile, and Electron is for desktop, progressive web apps, and mobile and desktop web. And again, what's really powerful about this is we can use the web skills that your web developers or you yourself as a web developer have spent many years investing in. So we're using the same tech that we know and love, and that's been around for decades at this point. And then again, through the power of and magic of Cordova, we get full access to the native APIs and plugins. So let's get kind of back over to the Cordova side and tackle all these different issues and kind of see, some strategies to work on them. So the first one I wanted to start with was dependency management. So this is a big sticking point, and when I was putting this together, realized that it extends so much more beyond Cordova. Cordova is really one piece of the puzzle when it comes to an Ionic project, and I thought it was important to kind of step back and talk about the whole landscape and what's involved, because understanding all these pieces of technology are really important, whether you're debugging any type of web project, code framework like Ionic, Angular, all those kind of things, or Cordova itself. So in modern web applications, as we see on our right side here with all the different technology we can use, they allow us to move so much faster and build these just awesome experiences at a fraction of the time. But the reality is that it's become, because there's all these different tools that we need, the web stack has become more complicated. And that's true. That's true regardless of whether you use Ionic or any other tooling or framework. That's just kind of the reality today. So it's kind of a give and take there of more power, but for lack of a better term, more responsibility. So there's what happens when you run into different issues is that you often are not sure what's going on. And a lot of that is because there can be incompatibilities between each layer of the web stack, right? Between your web framework of choice that you often choose to pair with Ionic. We have recently, with our newest version of Ionic, worked with web components, which means we can support all different types of frameworks, including Angular, Vue, and React, and beyond. Ionic itself, Cordova, and the native side of the house, especially on mobile, can be challenging. And then there's also the challenge of third-party JavaScript libraries. There's going to be other functionality that you bring in. So I'm going to kind of break these down in terms of each part of the dependency management stack there, and take a look at first at JavaScript libraries and look at each of these individually and kind of how they work together. The first one is our JavaScript libraries. And this is, again, does tie back to Cordova because there is a JavaScript API inside of the house on that as well. So I wanted to take a step back here and briefly mention package.json and package lock. So these two files are how, where we see our dependencies listed, right? So all of the JavaScript libraries and frameworks that our project uses, you'll see this within an Ionic project and many other types of web projects too. And really the main thing to note here is, because there's often confusion between the two, is when you run an npm install command and start adding different projects, different libraries to your project, the really key takeaway to know is that the package lock file is something that we want to hold on to. And it's there for us to, whether you're talking about setting up a new machine, moving through a CI/CD process between dev to production and environments, the goal of that file is to lock in exact dependencies and that huge dependency tree that each project and dependency needs, and allow them to ensure that when you're running a new npm install command on a new machine, or a new teammate joins and you pass the project and have them start their Ionic project, you want to make sure that you get the same dependencies, because often with the way that semantic versioning works, you see all these different major, minor, and patch version numbers and different ways of and strategies of resolving those. It can get confusing really fast. So key thing to know is when you're actually restoring a project is looking at package lock, not necessarily package.json. And the other, kind of to dig in this a little bit more, that's really interesting, it can be a challenge for teams, is when you run the default npm install command, that adds that dependency and marks it as defaulting to the minor version. So meaning when you install that or restore and update and maybe upgrade to the next package, you're going to end up with the latest minor version. And the reality is, so with the way semantic versioning works is, like all software, it's written by humans and we make mistakes, right? The reality is that the goal of using either the minor version or restricting it to the patch version is, the whole goal is to avoid issues, right? To have safe upgrades, library maintainers, et cetera, are trying to make sure that when you update, it's a smooth experience. You don't actually break your project, because we know that can waste a lot of time. But we've seen a lot of teams run into problems with this default minor version versus the more locked down patch version, where you'd only get bug fixes, or even using the exact version without any of the asterisks, tildes, et cetera, characters on the front there. That's the most locked down. So, kind of what we have some tips on, what the Ionic team has used for when we work with customers on version management, right? And a few options here. So the first one is, again, lock the version explicitly. So that's where, again, we kind of are not using that default caret icon, which means use the lock to the minor version when you install a new package. Interesting to note, though, there is an increased maintenance cost there because you have to keep referring back to your package JSON file and make sure that when you do want to upgrade, you might have to tweak that number manually, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you've been, I would say, if you've been burned with issues from any kind of library, any JavaScript library, then maybe consider locking that explicitly. The next one is locking to the patch version. So that's a little bit more restrictive, and you still get easier updates because that will ensure that if you're moving from maybe an update of 4.1.2, 3, 4, etc., way less likely to introduce issues into your project, but you're still getting like security and bug fixes and things. So it's kind of a good middle of the road. Still a little bit riskier in the sense of, you don't necessarily know what you're getting, and manually coming through that every single dependency you have is just probably not feasible, right? The other option that's kind of neat to mention, coming right from our customer success team, I just learned about this one, is NPM has the option to add an npm-rc file. And what that does is there's all different types of settings behind that. You can go research that. There's, I'm sure, tons. Honestly, I don't know a lot about them, but the really neat one is save-prefix there. And as you might imagine, that can override the default minor version caret that NPM defaults to. So in this example, we're using the tilde for minor version, or if you left it blank, then that would lock it to that explicit version every time you add a new dependency. So if you want to do that, on a team, and if you have a larger team especially, you don't want to have to remember to do these first two. That's kind of a nice option to be like a catch-all. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, kind of like a catch-all, yeah. Let's move over to, kind of Cordova dependencies next, which is just a couple notes on this. Really is it's just important to note that there's two different, kind of pillars here. There's the platforms you're working with. So that's the, mobile, desktop, what have you. So that would be typically iOS or Android. There's versions and code behind that. And then specifically, and they are linked, you have the plugins. So that's your native hardware device type of features like the camera, Bluetooth, you see splash screen here, things like that. And there's two different files here. So you have the package JSON is the JavaScript side of the libraries, because there's JavaScript code and then there's the native code implementation per platform that has to interact. The key thing here is just to make sure that these version numbers match. So whether you're on the platform side of the house, between config XML, which is our native code, make sure that these specification numbers match ideally. Yep. You can run into issues where they might be, offset or installed the wrong version. So that's probably just the best thing to do there. And then same with plugins, it's very similar styling, a little bit different tags, because again, this is JSON versus XML, but a lot of the names are pretty easily identifiable. Cordova plugin splash screen matches over there. So mostly straightforward in that sense. Some other tips specifically for managing Cordova plugins and platforms. The first one would be, make sure you use the CLI, which is command line interface tool, your command line tools. So make sure you use that. Typically, instead of directly editing the config XML and package JSON, when it comes to upgrading, updating, removing and adding them, that's kind of a general rule. Going in and editing things, it's far more likely to make a mistake, honestly, versus let the tool do all, its job in a sense, and it's there to help you out anyway. Additionally, the Ionic team provides, if you run Ionic Cordova instead of just Cordova and then whatever command, the team has built over time a bunch of different additional functionality and different commands you can look up in our docs that, is also kind of a nice thing to do, and, makes the Cordova experience, whether you're just day-to-day doing development or repairing things, it works a lot better. The next tip is to upgrade safely. So make sure that you're actually, again, using the CLI, and first, when it comes to plugins, removing the plugin, the old version, and then re-adding it. Kind of a funky workflow versus just one command to update it, but this ensures that all of the native bits and everything underneath the hood is removed cleanly, and you're off to the races and safe in that sense. The other idea here is use explicit versions. So by default, when you run Ionic Cordova plugin add and then the plugin name, you'll always get the latest version. And typically that is a good idea, but if you're working on a more of a legacy project, you might want to look into and set, using the @ symbol there, a specific version number when you add it. Next up, when it comes to restoring platforms and plugins, excuse me, the prepare command is really helpful because this restores all of our platform code and plugin code, reading from package.json and config XML. The really key thing that I found buried in our Cordova documentation is if there's conflicts between the two, meaning again, got to keep those version numbers in sync, but if something were to happen, package.json takes precedence over config.xml. So if you ever run into weird issues with that, I would look, compare those files and see what's going on there. The other thing that I find that oftentimes folks don't necessarily know is we have some really cool Ionic command line commands that are built into our tooling. Ionic Doctor is really great for detecting common Cordova issues and Angular issues, and I'm sure we're going to add more over time to that. It suggests steps to fix them and can even do them for you, which is really cool. And then Ionic Repair is kind of our great kind of nuclear option catch-all. Really big fan of that. So that removes and regenerates all your dependencies. So that includes your node modules folder and your Cordova code and platforms, and then reinstalls the JavaScript side of the house with npm install and all of the Cordova things. So that can be something really useful for sure. Next up, let's talk a little bit about Ionic Native. So for those that don't know, Ionic Native acts as a wrapper, JavaScript wrapper around our Cordova plugins. So basically adding and working with on the JavaScript side of things in your actual Ionic code, just adds a bit of asynchronous help and promises and observable support to Cordova plugins, which makes them a little bit more modern and easy to work with. TypeScript support, which Ionic projects by default use. So that's, I really recommend kind of looking at those that are native docs there. The key thing to mention though is they are separate open source projects and they do tie back to each other. So I would say when you're looking to debug an issue or you have an issue with a plugin that you'd like to file, my recommendation is to actually log it on the Cordova side of the house, their GitHub page, because the maintainers are going to far more likely to see it and address it in the actual plugin project versus Ionic Native. The Ionic team is constantly looking at issues too and helping out, but just kind of something to note. Update to the latest and greatest of both when you're interacting with them. So if there's an Ionic Native update, make sure that it gels nicely with the Cordova plugin or plugins you're using. You can always I recommend looking at release notes for Ionic Native as well as each plugin over time as you maintain them. And that's just great for seeing what latest issues and fixes were applied. Next up, we have Angular dependencies. So I wanted to cover this. Historically, Ionic's only been tied to Angular, but with the latest version of our UI framework, version 4, that was released in January, we are really excited to offer very soon, we're in beta right now, React and Vue support. So I don't have any kind of tips just yet on that, but for those that are, the majority of our folks still using Ionic 3 or Ionic 4, Angular is really great to touch on. So a couple of neat tools to point out here. Part of everyone has a CLI tool these days. It's just the, popular thing to do. So from the ng CLI tool, which is Angular's, you can run the ng update command, and that'll show you specific, look at your package.json and show you specific Angular projects that could be updated. So that's kind of nice to do and see, what you can move to there. And even really cool at update.angular.io, they have this neat little wizard tool where you actually plug in the current version of Angular that you're using and the one that you want to move to, and it'll provide, you can see here, in this case 6 to 7, but it'll give you all these different guides of like, here's what's been deprecated, here's what to watch out for, if depending on your app complexity, here's some other tips. So highly recommend that as you're constantly updating your projects and keeping them up to date. Next up, I want to talk on, in the Ionic specific side of the house, and the Ionic CLI versus the framework. So this is something that when I started, was a little confused on too, and with all these version numbers, and again, all this tooling, especially when you're new to this space, can be admittedly a little confusing, right? But the main thing here is The Ionic command line tooling is not the framework. And what that means is when you're running npm install Ionic, that's grabbing all of our tooling around projects that help you build projects, create them, update them, all that kind of stuff. But to actually update your Ionic project. So when we release a new version, sometimes there might be a CLI update separately, but often what you want to do is actually update, run an npm install on your Ionic flavor, which I'm going to show on the next screen actually. So in this case, if you're Angular, it'd be at Ionic/Angular, okay? And it's at latest as well. The other thing to note is if you run the command, the CLI command Ionic info, that'll give you whether you're debugging something or want to share an issue with the team, really, really useful because that spits out, all of our version numbers for what you are using. So here's one example from a recent starter project I was working on internally. You'll see that I'm at Ionic CLI version 4.12, but the framework, aka Angular, was 4.1.2. So there you go. And then Ionic Native happens to be at version 5.2 or higher by now. So again, that version numbers can be confusing, but note that this is one command you can use to kind of keep track of like what's going on and what actual project version you're at and what you want to be. On the Ionic, so as I was saying, on the Ionic 4 side of the house, you're going to have /Angular/Vue, React, and on over time as we support other frameworks, right? And then if the package name is actually, if you're on an Ionic 3 app, it's Ionic-Angular. And then when we want to kind of look and see, if another command to run is npm outdated here in the center on our Ionic particular packages or any other node package, JavaScript package too. It's not just for Ionic, but you can run that, and it produces this really great chart here in the center about like, you're running this current version, here's the latest, and here's what you could or should update to for your project, right? And then you just can grab that explicit version number or run latest and save exact. So that's kind of the differences there. Kind of a note, just in a moment here, we're going to get to our awesome demos. Really excited about that. But just kind of a general note on managing dependencies and strategy there. I think the biggest thing I wanted to get across is just remember, it is tempting to, when you see a run npm outdated and see this huge list of JavaScript packages that are outdated. We've all done that. We've all been there. We've all done that, just wanting to update it in one fell swoop. But as a team, we really just don't recommend that because, of course, if you were to update everything at once, that surface area for issues to arise is just huge, right? And how do you figure out what's going on? We'll have some more tips on that, of course, but why make it hard on yourself if you can help it? So what we kind of say is, go work one step at a time, right? Create a separate branch in your code for each change, each layer of the stack, Ionic, Cordova, whatever, web platform, other libraries, and, upgrade them, test them out, do lots of testing, and then, roll them into master and your actual project. Additionally, what I kind of like to say is happy apps are updated often, right? So, and happy apps are stable apps and vice versa. So while it's not as fun to manage our dependencies, and we want to always build more cool features and, have so many other concerns as developers for releasing software and project management and whatever. The reality is if you stay on top of these updates, they're not only far less painful, but you're setting yourself up for some really great things, right? You get security fixes, new features, oftentimes in especially the mobile space, improved performance, whether it's with our Ionic framework itself or Cordova as well. Always there's, performance stuff, and you get that for free usually, which is awesome. Kind of a quick note on when you should update though, because it's not just update all the time. The reality is, right, especially when working on larger teams, you have to kind of take a step back and think, where does it fit updating compared to where does it fit in my team or project goals for whatever sprint I'm on, maybe the quarter, maybe the whole year, depending on how much your teams plan out. as well as like what's the nature of the update. Is it a shiny new feature for TypeScript that maybe will make me a little bit, I don't know, more, develop faster? Or is it like where it's like, okay, we could wait a little bit? Or is it a critical security fix, right? Where, oh my gosh, we are, depending, it doesn't even matter what industry you are these days, probably should be a priority, right, to get that out. The best way to kind of stay on top of these things, the reality is it's really challenging because, again, you have all these different tools, but you have to kind of just keep on top of researching official blogs from each company, following the news and things like that. Next, we're going to look at conflicts and build failures, which we had put out a question on Twitter about, what's our biggest challenge that you run into as an Ionic dev, and this was by far number one. So naturally, I covered it at number two. But again, here's really what happens, and when I thought that I think is why this is so challenging. I had to throw a meme out here. When something, whether you're updating or you come back to a project and you try to kick it off and it just stops working, you say, well, what happened there? That's ridiculous, right? Who's the culprit, right? We have all these different, again, pieces of the layer of the technology stack, and it ends up being a finger pointing game and just a big headache and frustration for you as a developer. So typically, with the problem here is, while we could have picked individual specific issues, the reality with this, especially on the mobile side, is there's so many things that could go wrong. I mean, it's just software in general. So, I'm going to show some debugging tips in just a minute, but the reality is there's only more of a general strategy that I can give you today, because it's just the nature of, the beast almost of just how this works. So I would say generally plugins conflict with each other. And when it's some of the more confusing error messages that really don't seem to have anything to do with Ionic or Angular and other frameworks, it's likely due to the sharing of different native dependencies, right? And so what that really means is you often will have one plugin trying to access the same native code on a device or within the iOS or Android operating system. A good example of this that we see often is with Google Play services. So that is, underneath the umbrella of, let's say you're using Google Maps, Firebase for cloud, things, Google authentication through that. Maybe each one of those wants a different version. For 24 over here, I'm making up these numbers, 27.1, sure, whatever it was, and it's still painful, right? So the best thing you can kind of do is make sure that you're satisfying whatever minor, like let's say base version of these that they want, and make sure those aren't conflicting, as kind of like a general strategy. The other, tip we kind of see here is if you're testing different plugins and there's many open source versions of a lot of the different common use case plugins out there. So what I've often seen happen too is you end up installing one and then another within the same like feature and functionality and leaving them in there, and then they start conflicting because again they're modifying some of the same settings, overwriting different files. A good one is push notifications because everyone wants to build those. If you're using multiple libraries there, you might run into trouble. So work again one branch at a time, one feature at a time, and like one vertical slice, and you'll have far less trouble with those. As a general strategy for troubleshooting failed builds, we do have some options there that I found are not always the most obvious. So, the main thing is, of course, research the build errors when you happen. They can be scary because, again, especially on the mobile side, the whole point of this, the hybrid approach, is we don't want to have to dig too deep into it. We just want to be happy web devs and build, right? But as the nature of software, issues will happen. So what you can do is, of course, check out Google and Stack Overflow. Many of these errors are documented online, and often, because Ionic and all these frameworks have been around for so many years, there's lots of great info out there because it's highly unlikely that you're encountering an error that hasn't happened before. Additionally, we have our customer success team runs a great knowledge base at ionic.zendesk.com, so check that out. And we have more also on the forum side of the house. Check out our Ionic forum. Great community members there behind that, willing to jump in and help out. And we specifically have an Ionic native category, factored in under the Cordova, kind of issues and things as well. And then we have a worldwide Slack, so you can jump in and get real-time assistance from our community members. So that's a really great option. So on that note, now let's have a little bit of fun. We are going to jump into our demos. Let's see here. Nope, not going there yet. So just give me a second here. We're going to start with, I'm going to debug, kind of show off a couple Cordova issues on a real Android and a real iOS device here. And first, we're going to start off with Android. Let me get that unlocked. Okay, so this is an app I'm using to stream the Android phone to our my computer here. So let's get that up, and then let's do kind of show the code. I'm gonna close that. Okay, so we're going to kind of show some interesting ways of debugging on actual devices from your laptop or computer. So the first one I wanted to look at was a couple things vis-a-vis debugging with Chrome and then debugging with Android Studio. So there's some really cool things we can do there. So the first one, so I have an Ionic starter app here. You can see that on the left, the tab. This is our tabs template. So we can actually use the Chrome inspector, which is Chrome://inspect. And this is really neat. So with the phone physically connected over USB to my laptop here, you see that we have these remote targets. So this is my Android phone, and we can actually tie into and inspect. Let's click that and get the dev tools for the app running on the device. So that's really powerful for looking at the Ionic Angular website of the house, running things. But what's even more powerful, and this is admittedly a trivial example, but I just want to kind of show off the tooling in this case. For Cordova plugins specifically, oftentimes they're globally accessible through a navigator object. So in one simple example, we can actually run, and I'm going to use the splash screen here. So navigator.splash screen, and we can call methods that are part of the JavaScript API, same as your app would. So this is really, really neat. And I'm gonna hit return to actually show that. So that actually is firing off the native code through the JavaScript API, just like your app would. And that's really cool because while a trivial example in a way there, if you had a function or you're trying to debug something on a device, you want to be able to move as fast as possible and really get stack traces and see where your errors are. And because the reality is, as you will see in a later example, we don't get nice stack traces on the screen of the device itself, right? You can use an alert message, which is clunky and really not a best practice anyway, but it just doesn't work well. So the next thing is I can also hide it as well. So really kind of cool. We can toggle that, and that's, again, simple example, but really powerful. Next, we're going to look at very similar here, the pulling up Android Studio. So as much as as web developers, we get a little skittish when it comes to working with the native IDEs. So that's Xcode for iOS and Android Studio for Android. I will say there's a couple cool little things you can do that make this a lot easier to work with, right? And especially specifically when it comes to running, figuring out what's going on in your app. So I admittedly, there's only a few things I know in this, honestly, but it gives me a lot of power for debugging issues, right? So what we have down here is logcat, which allows us to see not only the JavaScript logging, like console logging and errors, but the native errors as well. So as you can imagine, when something's going on and you're not sure what's happening on the hardware side of things, you can see exactly what's going on here. The key thing to note is from the View menu, you can go to View and then Tool Windows and then Logcat to open this. I had already previously opened it. You can close that. You then can select your device that's plugged in, your application as well, your app ID, and then different logging levels. It's helpful to search for Ionic. Because on Android specifically, there's tons and tons of system calls and other logs that kind of muddy up the waters there and make it a little bit harder to see. But we can see the full code there. And then what's really neat is you can actually open up either the compiled APK, the actual native code, or open up your Ionic project, and that's under the, if we go back over to VS Code, platforms, Android or iOS, and we can open up this Android folder or dig deep down into, what folder is it again?
I believe it's the build folder.
Yeah, the build folder.
Sorry, I think it's under app. It's a ways down in there.
It's a ways down in there, yeah. Let's see if we can find it really quick. Yeah, build.
Generated output, or sorry, it's outputs.
Yeah, outputs, APK, boom. Yeah, so it's a little, admittedly, I got to go some digging, but so that's here. So I've already, gone ahead and opened that. And let's go back to Visor. And what's really cool is if you hit the play button here and everything's connected, we see that. So we can hit OK, and it'll actually install the APK in this case and pull up the app again. And you see all the logs that are happening, a lot of Ionic native and our Ionic type of logs. If I go on the device here and go to tab 2, I'm going to tap this is a basic camera functionality that you've probably seen if you've been on other webinars before. So now, whoa, take a picture. That looks great. And then when I actually accept that and display this here in the app, don't look at our funny faces, but look over here. As you'll see, like we have, this is right here, camera success taken is from my tab 2 module JavaScript code Ionic app. So, and alongside, again, other native code and logging, right? The next thing we're going to switch to, it's going to take a second here.
Just really quick, Matt, I just wanted to note this is really, really powerful from a troubleshooting perspective, because if you're completely lost in your code and you can't find that one error that you're trying to find, you have a crash or somewhere in your app or something like that, this is where the power of the native IDEs really come into play. So
oh, absolutely.
And you can see console output and stuff like that in here too. So it's just that one extra piece of information that you might need to finally get your issue figured out.
Yeah. No, that's a great tip. And as I've been building out my own apps or internal apps for the company here, like I've been appreciating it more and more, honestly. Yeah, just having more insight into what's actually going on. All right, so I'm just hooking up QuickTime on my iOS device here. We're going to maybe not.
Give it one more shot.
Good old QuickTime. Let's try it one more time. Let me close some things here. Oh, there we go. Yeah, awesome. All right. Thanks for hanging in with us here, everyone. We're going to show a couple really neat things on the iOS debugging side of the house, both with Safari and Xcode. So again, through the web and with our native tools. So if we open Xcode, so again, doesn't have to be incredibly scary to kind of dig into how this works. But when I open up my Ionic project, there's really just a couple things to note. The general tab and the info tab can be really powerful. You'll see a lot of the elements of our config XML that have been transformed into the iOS specific side of the house. And specifically, I wanted to run this on the device. So this is my app over here, but I'm going to kick it off from here with the build command. And I've got it attached to my iPhone. So that's going to just take a moment, and we'll get some other things prepped here. But again, very simple design, similar to Android Studio, where it's really easy to just do some basic debugging without having to really spend hours and hours learning the native IDEs.
Yep.
All right. So here's our app again, and I'm going to go over to tab 2. And what's really neat is before I look at kind of the native logs over here, I'm going to pull up Safari. So this is a really cool little tip. If you open Safari, we can actually dig into the web console as well. We go to develop and then your iPhone or iDevice and then localhost. You can hear my fan kicking off here. We'll see if this works for us. And then very similar to the Android side of the thing of the house, we can run the show and hide method on the splash screen. So again, executing native code, the Cordova plugins, live on the device. Okay, and we can show and hide that and interact pretty easily there. So I'm gonna quit that. Specifically though, one kind of cool way to troubleshoot something is we're going to look at a real example. So the Android app worked. The camera worked. We were able to take a selfie. That was pretty cool.
Yep. Very
handsome gentleman here. But if I'm going to tap the phone icon here, right? And ooh, oh, of course that worked that time. Yep. So that was not supposed to happen. So let's pretend that did not happen. What should have happened, and we'll kind of follow up later with a video demoing this, is we should have had the app crash. Okay, what I was expecting to have happen, and that's fine. It's fine. We'll just talk through it. What I expected to have happen is anytime there's a app crash or anything from the native side, we'll see this in the logging down here in Xcode, something we wouldn't see on our Ionic CLI or other types of tooling, right? So what particularly happened, specifically, we're not going to debug in right now to keep things moving, but what we can do is we would have seen an issue that said something about permissions not being correct, right? Or missing something where we wanted to access the phone. And, as it turns out, again, this is where if we go to our Cordova plugin camera is the name of the plugin, right, from under Apache, we can look for different quirks, issues to be aware of, and sure enough, since iOS 10 with iOS, there's different usage descriptions and permissions we have to prompt the user for. So apologies for that. We're not going to be able to show that off with a lot of time. But basically what this actually means is we need a couple configuration permissions to drop in here. It's actually just one for basic camera things. And what happens is they go in, drop them into our config XML file and save that. And we would edit our description. So we're going to we would say something a little bit better than the default, but it'd say, we want to take selfies, or, access the camera to take selfies. We can save that. We would, because it's on the native side of the house, we would actually need to run a fresh build to push that code over into our the actual native scaffolding of the project with Ionic Cordova build iOS. I'm not going to run that just because looks like it had cached my settings from before setting up the demo, so that's okay. But the reality is what we would have happen next, if I hadn't already accepted that, the camera would work now like it is, and we could take a fresh picture. And there I am, and we'll just move on from that.
Yeah, this is a really great point. So you did the right thing here. You kind of isolated what particular plugin was going to be giving you problems, and then you went to the repo and said, okay, is there anything I might be missing that I need to make changes in my application to make sure that it's working the right way?
Exactly. And sometimes, and that's kind of the funny thing, that's a really good point, is often when you're working through an issue, you're not sure what happened, right? Or so again, that's where if I didn't know already what happened, I probably would take a step back, stop running the app on my phone, run Ionic repair to kind of clean out my dependencies and just kind of start fresh, especially when it comes to more of the native side of things, right? So kind of wrap up the last couple items we have here. The next kind of top issue and challenge we see with Cordova is native related bugs, speaking of, and feature requests. So, plugins are open source and free, and that's great because there's all the core functionality like the camera we just saw, Bluetooth and geolocation, all kinds of things that have been created by community maintainers over many years now. A good decade plus or so. And additionally, they're open source. But the challenge again is, what do we want to do if you want a feature of working with the camera that is beyond the basics of what the open source plugin wants, right? That's kind of challenging, right? Because they're built with native code. There's no way around that. And they're open source, but the whole point of the hybrid stack is you don't want to have to learn that stuff, right? So you have some options. You can file an issue on GitHub. Contacting the maintainer directly is one option too. Admittedly, it could get lost in the sea of issue management. Often, the reality there is there's 10,000 of us versus a handful of maintainers out there, so that can get a little backlogged. So another option is you can fork the plugin and hire a native developer, which admittedly can be a little expensive though, depending on your team's needs and size, but that's one option. Or additionally, contract it out, hire consultancies or contractors to add that add or update that plugin if you can't wait for the community and are unsure if they're going to get to that particular issue or new feature, right? Stay tuned for a second. We also have a solution relating to this that we're going to just briefly touch on towards the end. And the last kind of major Cordova concern that I wanted to touch on here was, how do we go about, taking a step back when we're starting from scratch or we have a new feature to implement? How do we find the right plugin, right? How do we know when we're searching through all this huge open thousands of open source lists of plugins, right? How do we know which one is the right one for us and which one will work well? Well, my first actually piece of advice is, thinking about, do you actually need a Cordova plugin? What's really great about the web platform continuing to evolve, especially the last few years, more and more of native type of features are coming to it through the browsers, Chrome, Safari, Firefox, all of them. So this what the web can do today website, I highly recommend, keeps an active list of, we have a few of them here, giving you access to more of it is more primitive APIs that the browsers have. So it's, you have to really have to look at and see if it fits your use cases. Yep. But, first take a step there and see if maybe, if the plugin's not doing what you want, you might be able to just build it in web technology, that new feature or bug fix. But if you do decide to go with a plugin, I would say start with our Ionic native suite of plugins that we've reviewed and approved. So again, these are the same, really just web wrappers and TypeScript and bringing other features to the Cordova plugins on the JavaScript side. Again, check out our documentation for the library and all the available list of plugins. Additionally, then beyond that, and as a jumping off point from Ionic Native, really, look through the open source community, right? So the main core plugins, which I would say are splash screen, battery, camera, again, have a common name structure, Cordova-plugin-name, under the Apache GitHub repo and repos. And as a general tip, when it's, depending on what it is, try to look for official plugins backed by a real company with full support. Look at the maintenance record of the plugin. Does it have recent consistent commits? When was the last release? And high issue count, again, may be a concern, may not be, because again, there's always going to be more folks using a plugin than maintaining it, just like any kind of software. So depending on, volunteers, hobbyists, maintainers, whatever their status is and when they can work on them, it may or may not be an issue for you. Just a quick brief note before we get over to our live Q&A here. We do have some Ionic solutions for teams that can help with especially the Cordova and native mobile and beyond side of the house. So we just want to kind of touch on that. The first one, I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions about. Really looking forward to that because it's really cool. We have the Ionic Capacitor project, which is currently in beta. Not quite production ready in version 1.0, but getting there very, very soon, as I understand it. Think of this as our spiritual successor to Cordova. The idea here is bringing just kind of a fresh look at the decade-long plus history of Cordova and building and extending on top of that. So it's backwards compatible with Cordova and brings new features to the Ionic ecosystem. You can use it with an Ionic app or on its own, but basically it's providing, again, that native abstracted layer to allow you to take your one code base and extend it onto other platforms. It's just a different, there's some differences between it. So what's really neat though is we've really been able to extend onto other platforms compared to Cordova. So progressive web apps, desktop, and I have to say, having like one standard API for like the camera that works across everything is immensely impressive and, and just really fun, really nice, right? Additionally, like the biggest thing I wanted to highlight is you just have more control. With Capacitor, rather than using kind of more Cordova's abstracted approach, where again you have config XML that gets taken by the Cordova build process and transformed into each platform-specific setting, which we didn't even have, unfortunately, time to get into. That's a whole nother thing. Capacitor puts control back onto the native IDEs, and each platform's specific tooling and things like that. So, one that can, again, seem a little, scary, or say, why are we doing that? But the reality is, when we let each tool do its job well and maintain its expertise within it, honestly, we're seeing better results than that, versus trying to come up with some magical tool that may or may not work over time and becomes brittle, right? Just the honest truth there. And what's kind of neat as another benefit is, if you have a mixed team of native mobile developers and web developers, they're able to work together a little bit more cohesively than if it was a Cordova project. So look for that to be production ready very soon. We'll have the links to the slides and everything at the end and later, but check out this link to a Capacitor webinar that I ran a few months ago. Goes way deeper into that, and hope you'll check that out. Then, as another option we wanted to talk about really briefly, is we have recently launched Ionic Enterprise Edition. At a very high level, it's our serious teams building really amazing, incredible apps. We want to help you and partner with you on that. And really, the main thing to call out here is we have a bunch of different DevOps type of solutions, app creation tools, advisory and expert services, and especially the native bridge portion of it relates to Cordova, right? So what this really does is, we talked about a lot of the different challenges and the reality of the open source world and these plugins that your company and teams may depend on. You want to be able to move fast and actually be able to build rich experiences, and know that you're going to have the latest security fixes, new features, and things like that. And so that's where Ionic's here to help with that, right? So through our native bridge, we provide easy access to tons of different device features and third-party applications. So we have a core library of functionality that is provided to you. We integrate with all different types of popular third-party SaaS companies, tools, everything you can think of pretty much. And we take all of the proactive, updates, understanding the evolving ecosystem, keeping up with the latest news and applying that back to the code, all of that for you, so that you can focus on what really matters, which is delivering business value, delivering new features for your users and your companies, right? All backed by a really great support SLA from the Ionic team. So, again, the reality of open source Cordova development, it's been an immensely powerful tool driven by the community. But the reality is, with multiple maintainers, you have multiple points of failure when you start to rely on one of these plugins for your company business's app. And so, without any support SLAs or direct contacts, it can be a little risky, right? And that's just kind of the state of the landscape today. So with Ionic's Enterprise Edition, we give you one API, and you can access any connection through this native bridge we were just briefly talking about, fully maintained and backed by the Ionic team, with all of our mobile, native, and web expertise built up over the years. You have the experts in your corner. And again, we can do custom pre-built integrations, all of which work great across mobile, desktop, and progressive web apps. So give sales a reach out, check that out. We'd love to talk. So that was great. Yeah. Really excited to get to some Q&A now. Thanks for sticking with us, everyone. Let's move on over to some questions. Let's checking those pull out. That up. Just a moment.
Can already see we have a couple of questions about Capacitor. Matt, you already did a really nice job just kind of hitting on that a couple slides ago. Highly recommend folks check out the webinar that you previously did on that. That was fantastic. That's probably the best short-term piece of information that we have outside. I know there's also a blog post available on our blog about Capacitor and kind of what our next steps are for that. So that's a really good resource there.
Yeah, just to kind of summarize that one again, there's, I think, why Cordova or Capacitor? It really depends on what your team is using. If you're deeply embedded and like a lot of teams are in the Cordova space, that makes sense. And again, it's not quite at version 1 just yet anyway. So, you know, stick with that for now, but we're rapidly getting close to a full release on that, on Capacitor, and, you know, lots of exciting options there. I think, you know, one particular explicit example would be the camera. So if you're using, building an app that you really want to get across iOS, Android, and as a web app as well, the Cordova plugins, they only work they don't work necessarily on the web. Some of them do have some limited support, to be honest, but a lot of it is not fully built out, because originally the goal of Cordova was to reach mobile, okay? And that served us well for many years. But when you want to, I can't undersell the power of what Capacitor does bring, in that sense of having, you know, that one API that gives you, that automatically takes care of whatever platform and knows what platform it's running on. As a dev, that's just incredibly powerful for productivity, to, you know, rapidly innovating, things like that. What else do we have next?
Can we combine Capacitor and Cordova in the same project? I do not recommend doing that. They're meant to be separate platforms in a sense. So you should either have a Cordova project or you should have a Capacitor project. I don't recommend mixing the two. I think somebody also had a question regarding whether I should use the geolocation Cordova plugin or the geolocation Capacitor plugin. It's going to depend on whether or not you're using Capacitor in your project or if you're using Cordova. I know a lot of people who do make use of the geolocation Cordova plugin specifically in their Cordova applications. Works relatively nicely. It depends on which platform you're using in that sense.
So generally you'd say, you know, if you're going to migrate over to Capacitor, it's relatively painless, you know, but probably want to stick with one or the other. You know, you can move to Capacitor and bring in your Cordova plugins as well. So it's not a whole lot of rework or anything. It's just, something to be aware of.
Let's see. There's a good question there about Android Studio, actually. So how do I run my application in Android Studio? I always use the command Ionic Cordova run Android, and it doesn't open up the app in Android Studio. So that's a really good question. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. So one thing that I don't think you actually mentioned, Matt, is that you can actually run your application using the simulators available in Android Studio or Xcode, which can also be really powerful. It's not a one-to-one conversion. Simulators aren't perfect. So generally, if you can, and if you have a physical device available of some kind, whether it be for Android or iOS, highly recommend using those. There is a -- device flag that you can add to that Ionic Cordova run platform command, where it will do its best to try and find out if you have a physical device that is unlocked and ready to go, and try to run your device on there. That's generally the route that I would recommend going. The alternative is kind of what Matt and I were going through before in VS Code, where you can dig down, as long as you've done an Ionic Cordova build platform, so build iOS or build Android, within your VS Code or whatever IDE you're using to look into your web code, there should be a platforms folder in there if you're doing a Cordova project, and then under there should be an APK file for Android applications, or an IPA, let me start with Android. There's an APK file under there that you can then open in Android Studio, and that's what you can use to run. iOS is a little bit more interesting. You're going to actually open the .xc workspace file, which is also under that platforms folder. That'll open up your project in Xcode, and then you can actually run the application right from Xcode from there. We can write up a little bit more about that as well, because it does get a little confusing.
Let's see. Good question about someone having issues with building the app with Node 10.15.1. What version of Node.js do we recommend or support? So generally, I would say whatever the LTS, the long-term support version is what we'd recommend. I happen to pull that up here. I don't know if I can pull that. That's fine. Basically, that looks like 10.15.3, so slightly higher is what the current LTS version is. So I would say if there are other issues, you know, look at our Ionic GitHub, log an issue for the team, run that Ionic info command. We have a whole template that makes it easy to fill out, because specifically there could be something with Node, could be with the framework. It's hard to say, you know, right this second. But generally, again, the LTS version of Node is what we would support. Someone asking if the video and slide deck is going to be available anyplace. Yes, so we will likely later today, if not, by the end of the week, send out an email with a link to the recording as well as the slide deck. So we're going to have this all available. I know we showed a lot of links. I wanted to put a ton of effort and time to make sure that you had different jumping off points from here. So we'll absolutely make sure that gets out to all of you. Really excited to share that.
There's a very good question here, actually. Do you have an Ionic kitchen sink demo with the Cordova plugins? So you can use our Ionic starter projects, which are available through the Ionic CLI, or you can actually go on to GitHub and download them. Yep. Core Cordova plugins, it kind of depends on what your application is going to be using. So Matt, you had mentioned a couple of times the Ionic native wrappers. If you're going to be using specific plugins, I would recommend kind of downloading, starting with one of the starter projects, installing those wrappers and the associated plugins with them, and then kind of going from there. That's probably the best way to just kind of get a rolling start with that.
Yep.
Let's see.
Someone asked about with Capacitor, noticing the info plist and Android manifest files, meaning do you have to build your app in both Android Studio and Xcode? And the reality is, so yes, that's part of what we're doing with Capacitor, where we're actually moving toward embracing that. And I'm going to be honest, that was my reaction too. Why would we go towards the light, towards the native side of the house, right? And honestly, though, again, I really encourage you to, when we send this out, to look up the Capacitor webinar I did, where I go much more into depth on this. But I am completely sold on it and got over my initial hesitation and questions. And that's kind of all I'll say for now.
Yeah, I think one of the points to make there is don't be scared of the native IDEs. They can be very, very useful, because a lot of folks that are making Ionic applications, at the end of the day, they are ultimately putting out either an Android or an iOS application that's going to go out in the store. And to have a little bit of familiarity with the native side of things, it doesn't hurt, and it doesn't hurt to learn a little bit.
Absolutely.
There's another good question here. What are kind of your top 3 to 5 places to look to keep up with your iOS, Android, Cordova plugin updates, that kind of thing? You actually mentioned a couple of really good things in the presentation. So that npm outdated command is actually a really good place to start. You got to be careful with that, because it is going to give you all of your potentially outdated dependencies. And as we also mentioned during the presentation, updating those all at once is generally not a good thing. There's actually a really nice mantra that I kind of try to follow as far as plugin development and just general app development goes, and that's diligence and vigilance. So this actually kind of goes back to you mentioned a kind of a development strategy earlier on in the presentation too. Kind of making those small iterative changes, especially with plugins that you're comfortable with in particular. That's a really good strategy. That's kind of the diligence part of it. And then the vigilance is that kind of being aware of, what does need to be updated in my project, or it's been a little while since I've updated all my plugins and my dependencies. I should probably look at those. So that npm outdated command can be really useful. Ionic doctor check is another one that we mentioned. That's a great one for Ionic specific stuff. And then honestly, it kind of comes down to whatever resources are available for the plugins that you're using. So the GitHub repos, I would say, are probably the best resource there, because you can look at the releases, you can check the release notes, you can see what new features have been added or if things have been deprecated, that kind of thing.
I was going to say, on the Cordova specific side of the house, following their blog is really a great idea, because they are always posting immediately with full notes, release notes, whether it's the Cordova iOS, Android, the platform vertical, or often plugins themselves for some of the larger, more maintained ones. And that can be really useful, because oftentimes they might roll out a new version, but part of their strategy, as I was actually researching this, is understanding, and it makes sense, that the latest and greatest doesn't automatically get rolled into the command line tooling until weeks or months later. So sometimes if you're encountering issues, or you want to, look at, we have some questions about improving performance of native plugins and things, kind of give them a follow and see if something new is released. They've been kind of on a really great release cadence lately, pretty quickly. So check that out, as well as everything Brian said, for sure.
Is it always preferred to update the CLI version to the latest? I generally recommend, being on the latest CLI is generally usually a good thing. I believe our CLI is actually open source, so you should be able to go check the repo and check out the release notes and see if there's anything that would be kind of crazy. Most of our CLI updates are generally just adding functionality, and they shouldn't break anything. So generally, yes, I would say you should always update your CLI and try to be on the latest version, especially if you're using Ionic 4, because we just added a bunch of new functionality in the last couple of versions just to make sure that Ionic 4 apps are solid with our CLI. So.
Yeah, since the initial release, I've been incredibly impressed with the team just, releasing updates every couple weeks or so, both on the CLI itself as well as Ionic 4. Tons of performance enhancements, and we're definitely out there listening to you. Keep those issues coming and great feedback. It's it definitely is not falling on deaf ears for sure. Just keep it coming. We love the feedback, so it's wonderful. Maybe a couple more.
Shout out from Ionic, Utah. See you at the NGConf meetup. Love it. Absolutely love it.
Yep. A few of us will be out at NGConf in May in Utah. Yep.
It's awesome.
We are looking forward to that. Let's see.
A couple of people have asked, should I use Capacitor? Can I switch back to Cordova while I'm using Capacitor? I would generally say you should stick with one or the other. If you're kind of going back to what Matt had shown on the slide earlier, if you're looking for something that is, development or that's production ready and stable and ready to go like right now, I would generally recommend starting with Cordova. It's also because of the open source community, because it's been around for a while, there's a lot better documentation as far as the plugins and things go. If you're more bleeding edge, if you want to be on the cutting edge and you don't mind that Capacitor is still in beta, feel free to tweak around and play around with it. And you're obviously, it's kind of dependent on what your situation is. So I would generally recommend people start with Cordova, and then especially if you're not quite as comfortable with the native side of things yet, it's a nice kind of gateway for you in this hybrid ecosystem. So
great. Well, I believe that's all the time we have today for questions. So I wanted to say on behalf of all of the Ionic team, thank you so much for joining. I'm Matt Netkow, and this is Bryant Plano. Thank you so much, and we will be following up with, again, some emails and blog posts about some of the questions we didn't get to. So keep on, an eye out for that. And thank you again. Looking forward to having you join us next time.
Thank you very much.